The bustling city of Siloria was unlike any other planet Jackson had ever visited. Towering spires made of shimmering crystal rose into the sky, glowing faintly in the deep purple of the evening. The air was thick with the hum of advanced technology and the murmur of alien voices in languages he didn't understand. Jackson, a human from Earth, walked through the crowded streets, taking in everything with quiet fascination. His mission was simple: gather data on the alien species who inhabited this world and report back to his superiors. But from the moment he arrived, something about Siloria felt wrong. There were whispers in the streets, eyes following him from the shadows. As he made his way through the marketplace, a sharp sound suddenly cut through the air, followed by the thudding of boots on stone. Turning around, Jackson barely had time to react as two armed soldiers lunged at him, their weapons raised. They were fast, too fast. Before he could even draw his own weapon, a blur of motion swept past him, and the soldiers were knocked to the ground with incredible force. Jackson barely had time to blink before he was face to face with the woman who had saved him. She was tall, her skin shimmering silver like moonlight, and her violet eyes gleamed with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Her long, dark hair cascaded behind her like a cloak of shadows, moving as if it had a life of its own. There was something otherworldly about her, as if she didn't belong to the same reality as Jackson. She stepped forward, her movements fluid, with the grace of someone who had been trained in combat for a lifetime. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft yet commanding. "You're in danger, human. Come with me." Jackson was taken aback. He had heard stories of the Silurian royal family, but never imagined he'd cross paths with one of them. This woman could only be Karail, the princess. Her reputation as both a fierce warrior and a diplomatic leader was known across the galaxy. There were rumors that her enemies were growing bolder, seeking to overthrow her family's rule. But Jackson had never believed the stories, until now. Karail didn't wait for him to respond. She grabbed his arm and pulled him through the crowd, moving with incredible speed and agility, her every step calculated, as if she had been doing this for years. The soldiers, now slowly regaining their footing, shouted orders to one another in an alien tongue, but they didn't dare follow. It was clear they knew who Karail was, and even they understood that to challenge her would be a deadly mistake. They ducked into an alleyway, the shadows swallowing them whole as Karail pressed him against the stone wall. Her gaze locked with his, and for a moment, Jackson could only focus on the intensity of her eyes. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this mysterious, fierce woman who had just saved his life without a second thought. "Why did you save me?" Jackson asked, his voice low with confusion. "I wasn't even sure you were." "I'm Princess Karail," she interrupted him sharply, her voice cold, as if stating her title meant something more than just a name. "And you're not the one who should be running. It's me they want. But you," she added with a glance at his face, "you've become involved whether you want to or not. And now you'll have to trust me if you want to survive." Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. What had he gotten himself into? He hadn't signed up for this. All he wanted was to do his job, gather the information, and get back home. But now, standing before the most powerful woman on Siloria, he knew that his mission had just become much more complicated and far more dangerous. Yet despite the fear gnawing at him, there was something else in his chest, a strange pull, the kind of pull you couldn't explain but felt deep inside, urging him to follow. He didn't know it then, but that pull would only grow stronger with every step they took together. Karail, sensing his hesitation, didn't wait for him to respond. "We need to go now," she said, pulling him once more into the depths of the city. And as the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the horizon, Jackson realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. Karail pulled Jackson through the labyrinth of Siloria's narrow streets, her pace unrelenting as she guided him deeper into the city's shadows. The farther they went, the more it felt like they were being swallowed by the darkness. Jackson could barely keep up with her swift, sure movements. There was no hesitation in her steps, no doubt in the way she carried herself. It was as if this kind of escape was something she had done many times before. And that thought sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard the rumors about Karail, of course. How she was both a brilliant strategist and a formidable warrior, admired by her people and feared by her enemies. But standing beside her, in the middle of this underground world, he realized just how little he truly knew about her. He couldn't even imagine the kind of weight she carried on her shoulders. They reached a hidden door tucked away in a wall of ivy-covered stone, and Karail entered a code on a small panel by the door. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was bare, except for a few crates and a single table. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust. Karail closed the door behind them and turned to face Jackson, her expression unreadable. "You'll be safe here for a while," she said, her voice steady but laced with an underlying tension. "But not for long." Jackson felt the weight of her words hang in the air. The safety she promised him didn't seem real. He didn't feel safe at all. His mind raced with questions, but he couldn't bring himself to ask them. What had he gotten himself into? Why was he so important that he'd be targeted by the very people Karail had sworn to protect her people from? Karail seemed to sense his confusion and frustration. She walked over to the table and grabbed a small device, fiddling with it for a moment before turning it towards Jackson. "I'll explain everything soon, but first, you need to understand something. I'm not just protecting you because it's my duty as a princess. You've become a part of this war, whether you like it or not. You're now a target, and I can't let you face that alone." Jackson's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm just a guy from Earth. I'm not involved in any of this." Karail's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You don't know it yet, but you have a connection to this planet, one that even you don't fully understand. Your bloodline is tied to Siloria in ways you can't begin to imagine." She paused, her eyes distant as if lost in thought. "My enemies have been searching for you. For years, they've been hunting anyone who might stand in the way of their plans, and now they've found you. But it's not just your life they want. It's your power." Jackson blinked, trying to absorb what she was saying. "Power? I don't have any power. I'm just a regular human." "Not regular," Karail interrupted, her voice sharp. "You're much more than you think." She stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "And I won't let anyone harm you. That's why I'm making you a promise, Jackson. An oath. I will protect you, no matter what it takes. No one will hurt you while I'm here." Her words hung in the air like a vow. An unbreakable promise. Jackson could see the determination in her eyes, and for the first time since he arrived on Siloria, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't entirely alone in this. Maybe, just maybe, this alien princess would be the one person who could help him make sense of all this madness. But as Karail took a step back and turned toward the door, Jackson realized that her promise came with its own burden. If Karail was willing to risk everything to protect him, that meant the danger surrounding them both was far worse than he could have imagined. There was no going back now. Jackson was caught up in something much bigger than he could ever have dreamed, and his only hope was that Karail would be able to protect him, because he wasn't sure how he could protect himself. "Stay here," Karail instructed him softly. "I have to make sure no one is following us. I won't be gone long." As she left, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much darker journey. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was clear: his fate was now tied to Karail's. And with every passing second, the danger was growing closer. Jackson's mind raced as he sat in the dimly lit room, waiting for Karail to return. His heart still pounded from everything that had happened so far, being dragged into an alien conflict, having his life threatened by unknown enemies, and now discovering that he might have some kind of mysterious connection to Siloria. Nothing about this made sense. He was just an ordinary human. He'd come to this world to gather information for his mission, not to become part of an ancient war. Yet here he was, trapped in the middle of it all. The walls seemed to close in on him, the silence growing thicker by the second. Karail had been gone longer than he expected, and the longer he waited, the more his thoughts spiraled. What if she didn't come back? What if her enemies had already found her? Or worse, what if they found him? Jackson shifted uneasily on the hard metal chair, trying to shake the dread that crept up his spine. Just as the tension became unbearable, the door to the room creaked open. Karail stepped back inside, her face grim. Jackson shot to his feet. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "What's going on out there?" Karail didn't answer immediately. She closed the door behind her and took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she turned to face him, her violet eyes shining with an intensity that sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. "We've been found," she said quietly. "And it's worse than I thought. They've located your ship, Jackson. The people who are after you. They're not just looking for a way to hurt you. They want to use you. They want to control you." Jackson's stomach sank. Control me? For what? Karail's gaze softened, but the urgency in her voice remained. "Your bloodline, Jackson, it's not like other humans. There's something inside you, something powerful. I don't know what it is yet, but it's the key to the war that's coming. The one my enemies are preparing for." Jackson's mind struggled to process what she was saying. "But I'm just a regular guy," he insisted. "I don't have any power. I don't even know what you're talking about." Karail took a step forward, her eyes locked onto his with unyielding certainty. "You don't know the full truth about your past. Your ancestors were once connected to Siluria, long before you were born. They were part of an ancient alliance with my people, an alliance that was broken long ago." Jackson's confusion only deepened. "My ancestors? I don't." "There's more to your family's history than you realize," Karail interrupted. "Your bloodline carries a legacy, one that was hidden from you, perhaps even from yourself. This connection, it's what they're after. They want to harness your power to shift the balance of the war. If they succeed, the consequences could destroy everything." Jackson felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The room suddenly seemed too small, as if the walls were closing in around him. He'd never signed up for any of this. He was just a man from Earth, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now it seemed he was tangled in a web of political intrigue and ancient power. Karail's warning had a weight to it that he couldn't ignore. He wasn't just an innocent bystander. He was a key player in a much larger game. "Why me?" Jackson asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would they come after me? I don't even know what's going on." Karail stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Because you are the last of your bloodline. The last of a people who once stood by my ancestors. You may not know it, but you have the ability to control the ancient energies that run through this planet. And my enemies, those who want to take over Siluria, will stop at nothing to make sure they're the ones who control that power." Jackson could hardly breathe. This was bigger than he could have imagined. And the more Karail explained, the more he realized just how dangerous this was. He was not just running from danger. He was the danger. His existence, his bloodline, was at the center of an ancient conflict that could tear entire worlds apart. Karail placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch both comforting and heavy with the weight of the situation. "I swear to you, Jackson, I will protect you. But you need to trust me. We don't have much time. The enemies are already moving. And if we don't act now, we'll lose everything." Jackson's mind was reeling. But he nodded, feeling the surge of determination rise within him. There was no turning back. Whatever he was, whatever power he held, he had no choice but to face it. For the first time since he arrived on Siluria, he felt a sense of purpose. His journey had just begun, and the stakes were higher than he could have imagined. The air in the room grew thick with tension as Karail's words lingered in Jackson's mind. His thoughts raced, trying to piece together the truth about his bloodline, his power, and the enemies who were hunting him. The weight of it all felt overwhelming, but there was no time to process it. Karail's urgency was clear. His enemies were getting closer, and if they didn't act fast, they would be lost. "We need to leave," Karail said, her voice steady and commanding. "The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it becomes. They know we're here, and they won't stop until they find us." Jackson nodded, his stomach churning with fear and uncertainty. He had no idea where they were going or how they were going to escape, but he trusted Karail. She had protected him before, and he didn't have the luxury of doubting her now. Without another word, Karail moved swiftly toward the door. Jackson followed her, his steps hesitant but determined. The underground safe house had been their refuge for a brief moment, but now it felt like a trap. The walls seemed to close in, reminding him that danger was always just a step behind. As they exited the small room, Karail pulled a device from her pocket. She held it up to a nearby wall, pressing a button that activated a hidden panel. The wall shifted, revealing a narrow corridor that led down even deeper into the heart of Siluria. "This way," Karail instructed, leading the way down the passage. The walls of the tunnel were cold, their smooth surfaces lit by faint pulsing lights. Every sound echoed in the silence, the only noise being the sound of their footsteps and the occasional hum of the city above them. Jackson could barely keep up with Karail's pace. She moved with such precision, so sure of where she was going, while he stumbled in the dark, trying to make sense of everything she had told him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. They were entering a place where even Karail didn't seem completely sure of what lay ahead. "Where are we going?" Jackson asked, his voice tinged with concern. "We're going to meet someone," Karail replied, her voice low. "Someone who can help us. Someone who knows how to fight back against the people who want you." Jackson nodded, though the fear in his gut didn't subside. He wanted answers, but he was afraid of what he might find. Whoever they were going to meet, Jackson had no idea if they could be trusted. The idea of being caught between unknown enemies and mysterious allies made his head spin. They turned a corner in the corridor, and suddenly, Karail froze. Jackson barely had time to react before she pulled him back into the shadows, her hand gripping his arm tightly. Jackson's heart raced as he followed her lead, trying not to make a sound. There were footsteps ahead, heavy, deliberate steps. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were close. The enemy was near. Karail's eyes were sharp, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. She whispered, "Stay here. Don't make a sound." Jackson pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath as the footsteps grew louder. He felt the presence of danger like a shadow hanging over him. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then, just as quickly as they had come, the footsteps passed. Karail released a quiet breath, and the tension in the air slowly dissipated. "They're getting closer," she muttered. "We have to move faster." With no time to waste, they continued down the corridor, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. The tunnel seemed endless, twisting and turning with no clear direction. Jackson had no idea how long they had been walking, but the weight of their situation was growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, they'd reached the end of the tunnel, where a heavy steel door awaited them. Karail entered a code into the control panel beside it, and with a soft hiss, the door opened. Beyond the door was a vast chamber, filled with people and strange technology. Jackson's eyes widened in surprise. This was no ordinary underground hideout. It was a well-guarded base, hidden away from the rest of the world, and the people inside seemed to be expecting them. Karail stepped inside, motioning for Jackson to follow. "Welcome to our last chance," she said. "If we're going to stop my enemies, this is where it starts." Jackson couldn't believe it. They had finally found a place to regroup, but the war was far from over. He had no idea what came next, but he knew one thing for sure: his life and the fate of Siluria were now intertwined. The chamber they entered was unlike anything Jackson had seen before. It was a place of power, hidden deep beneath the surface of Siluria, filled with technology and artifacts that seemed to hum with energy. The air was thick with anticipation as Cariel led him through the crowded space, where beings from all corners of the galaxy spoke in hushed tones. They moved quickly, their eyes always scanning the room, aware of the dangers that lurked beyond the walls. Cariel seemed to know exactly where she was going. Her footsteps were purposeful, her eyes sharp. Jackson tried to keep up, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who were these people? What kind of power did they have? And what was going to happen to him? He had only been on Siluria for a short time, yet everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. At the far side of the room, Cariel stopped in front of a large metal door, its surface engraved with strange symbols Jackson couldn't understand. She pressed a series of buttons on a hidden panel beside the door, and it slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, there was a man standing in front of a glowing console. He turned as they entered, his eyes scanning Cariel before locking onto Jackson. "This is Jackson," Cariel said, her voice firm but respectful. "He's the one I told you about." The man, tall and lean with short silver hair and piercing blue eyes, studied Jackson for a long moment. His gaze was intense, as if he could see through him, beyond his human exterior, to the truth that lay buried inside. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this man knew more about him than he did himself. "I am Varric," the man said finally, his voice deep and smooth. "And you, Jackson, are the key to everything." Jackson swallowed hard. "What do you mean, I'm the key?" Varric's lips curled into a slight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't know the power you hold, do you? Your bloodline is more than just a link to an ancient past. It's a source of unimaginable energy, one that can shape the future of Siluria, or destroy it." Jackson felt his stomach twist. "I don't understand. I'm just a guy from Earth. I don't have any powers." Cariel stepped forward, her expression softening. "You're more than just a man, Jackson. Your ancestors, they were connected to a power that transcends time and space. It's in your blood, waiting to be unlocked." Jackson could barely comprehend what they were telling him. It was too much, too fast. He had come here looking for answers, but now it felt like he was drowning in them. Varric didn't give him time to think. "We have very little time," he said, turning his gaze back to the glowing console. "The enemies who are after you, they know what you are. They'll stop at nothing to control you, and if they succeed, Siluria will fall." Jackson's head spun. "How do you know all of this?" Varric paused, his eyes narrowing. "Because I've seen it. I've seen the future if they get their hands on you. I've seen Siluria burn." Cariel's voice was sharp, her tone filled with determination. "We can't let that happen. That's why we need to act now. We need to unlock the power inside you, Jackson. Only then can you fight back." Jackson shook his head, still unable to wrap his mind around everything. "But how? I don't even know what you're talking about." "You're not just anything," Varric interrupted. "You are the last of your kind. Your power is ancient, woven into the very fabric of this world. It's a gift, and it's your responsibility to use it." Cariel's voice softened as she stepped closer to him. "We believe in you, Jackson. You can do this. You can unlock your potential and save Siluria." Jackson felt a flicker of something inside him, a small spark of hope. But doubt was still heavy in his chest. What if he wasn't strong enough? What if he failed? Varric seemed to sense his hesitation. "It's not about strength. It's about understanding your purpose. Once you realize who you really are, everything will change." Jackson took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. There was no turning back now. He was in this whether he understood it or not. And if there was even the slightest chance he could stop the destruction of Siluria, he had to try. With a determined nod, Jackson looked at Cariel and then at Varric. "All right, what do I need to do?" Varric smiled, his gaze filled with something akin to approval. "We'll begin the process now. But remember, Jackson, unlocking your power is only the beginning. The real battle is just ahead. As the room around them seemed to buzz with energy, Jackson felt a strange warmth begin to spread through his chest, as if something deep inside him was awakening. The room grew even more charged with energy as Jackson stood before the glowing console. Karail and Varric watched him closely, their eyes filled with both anticipation and concern. Jackson could feel the strange warmth within him intensify, as if something was shifting deep inside his very core. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a pulling sensation that seemed to call to him, urging him to reach out, to embrace it. "I don't know if I can do this," Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands trembled slightly, the uncertainty growing within him. The power that was awakening inside him was overwhelming, too foreign, too vast. How could he, an ordinary man from Earth, possibly tap into something as ancient and powerful as what Varric and Karail were telling him? "You can," Karail said firmly, her voice calm yet filled with undeniable confidence. "You have everything you need within you. The question is whether or not you'll allow yourself to believe it." Jackson looked at her, trying to understand how she could be so sure. He had barely begun to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. Yet Karail seemed to have faith in him, faith he didn't even have in himself. Varric stepped forward, his hands hovering over the console, manipulating the controls with precise movements. "This is not about strength, Jackson. It's about connection. You are a bridge between worlds, between the past and the future. You carry the legacy of those who came before you. But to access it, you must learn to let go of your doubts." Jackson took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. The room around him seemed to fade, the buzzing hum of the console growing louder in his ears. He closed his eyes and tried to let go of his fear, just as Varric had said. His heart raced, but he reminded himself that this was the only way forward. There was no going back. As he focused inward, Jackson felt the warmth inside him expand, spreading through his veins like liquid fire. It wasn't painful, but it was intense, an energy so vast that it seemed to touch every corner of his being. He could almost hear whispers, ancient voices calling to him, guiding him toward something he couldn't yet understand. "Let it in," Karail urged, her voice a soft whisper in the back of his mind. "Trust it." Jackson's chest tightened as he followed her instructions. The energy swelled within him, and for a fleeting moment, he felt as if he was floating, detached from the world around him. In that brief instant, the doubts and fears that had plagued him seemed insignificant, like distant memories. His mind cleared, and all that remained was the connection, the bond that was forming between him and the ancient power within. He opened his eyes, and the world before him seemed to change. The console's glow intensified, casting strange patterns of light across the room. The symbols on the walls began to shift, moving as though alive, flowing like water, and Jackson realized with a jolt that they were not just symbols. They were a language he instinctively understood. It was as if the knowledge had always been inside him, waiting to be unlocked. Varric watched closely, a look of approval on his face. "You're doing it. You're awakening." Jackson felt a rush of excitement mixed with fear. He had done it. He had connected with the power inside him. But as the energy surged, a sudden vision overtook him. Flashes of destruction, of Siloria burning, of enemies closing in. He saw Karail, her face filled with fear, and felt a sharp pain in his chest. The vision was brief, but it was enough to shake him. The warmth inside him flickered, and for a moment, Jackson felt as though he might lose control. The power was too much, too overwhelming. He gasped, his hands trembling as the energy surged again, pushing him to the brink of collapse. He stumbled backward, struggling to maintain his focus. "Jackson," Karail called, her voice filled with urgency. She stepped forward, grabbing his arm to steady him. "You have to stay with it. Don't let it consume you. Focus." Jackson took another deep breath, closing his eyes once more. He felt the weight of the power within him. But this time, he didn't resist it. Instead, he welcomed it, allowing it to flow through him without fear. It wasn't about controlling it. It was about trusting it. The room began to settle, and the visions faded. The energy inside him pulsed, but it was no longer overwhelming. It was steady, under control. He opened his eyes, feeling different, stronger, more alive. "You did it," Varric said, his voice filled with admiration. "Now, we can fight." Jackson looked at Karail, her eyes full of pride and relief. He was no longer the man who had arrived on Siluria, confused and powerless. He was something more, something that could stand against the enemies threatening this world. But deep inside, he knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. Jackson's heart raced as he stood in the heart of the underground facility, the power within him now fully awakened. The room hummed with the quiet buzz of energy, and he could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on his chest. He wasn't just any man anymore. He was a warrior, chosen by destiny itself to protect Siluria from the chaos that loomed on the horizon. But despite the strength surging through him, doubt still gnawed at the edges of his mind. Was he truly ready for what lay ahead? Karail stood beside him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "It's time," she said softly, her voice steady despite the looming danger. "The enemy will be coming for you soon. We have to be prepared." Jackson nodded, taking in a deep breath. He had trained for this moment, at least in theory. He had honed his powers, learned how to control the energy within him. But the real test would come when they faced the forces determined to destroy them. There was no going back now. He had to be strong. For Karail. For Siluria. Varric, who had been silently observing, stepped forward. His silver eyes gleamed with sharp focus. "The enemy knows you've awakened. They'll attack in full force. You must fight with everything you have, Jackson. The power inside you is vast, but you must learn how to harness it quickly. Trust yourself." Jackson swallowed hard. "How do I know I can trust myself when I don't even know what I'm doing half the time?" Karail placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a reassuring smile. "You've already proven that you can control it. You just need to trust your instincts. The rest will come with time." Jackson felt a surge of gratitude toward her. She had believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself. But there was something else, something deeper, pushing him forward. He had a purpose now, and it was time to fulfill it. Just then, the sound of alarms echoed through the room, followed by the unmistakable thrum of engines. The enemy was here. Varric's expression hardened. "They've arrived sooner than we thought. Get to the battle stations. This is it." Jackson's pulse quickened. He followed Karail and Varric as they raced through the corridors of the facility, moving with practiced urgency. The air felt heavy with tension, and Jackson's senses were on high alert. He could feel the power within him, coiling and ready, but there was still a part of him that wasn't sure if he was truly ready. Could he really defeat them? Could he protect Karail? They arrived at the main control room, where a large screen displayed the movements of the enemy forces. Ships were descending from the sky, their sleek forms gliding effortlessly through the atmosphere. Jackson's stomach churned as he saw the numbers, far more than they had anticipated. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a force that seemed unstoppable. Karail turned to Jackson, her face determined. "We don't have much time. You have to take the fight to them. We'll be right behind you." Jackson nodded, his hands trembling. This was what he had trained for. This was his moment. He felt the power within him rise like a tidal wave, surging to the surface. He closed his eyes, focusing on the energy that had become an extension of himself. The warmth inside him had turned into a blazing fire, ready to burn through anything that stood in its way. With a deep breath, he opened his eyes. "Let's do this." The doors to the control room slid open, and Jackson stepped out onto the battlefield. His senses were sharp, every movement, every sound amplified. The enemy forces were already advancing, their soldiers moving swiftly across the ground, weapons raised. But Jackson felt no fear. He was ready. He raised his hand, focusing on the energy flowing through him. With a single motion, a wave of power exploded from his fingertips, sending a shockwave through the enemy ranks. The soldiers were thrown back, their weapons disintegrating in the blast. Jackson felt the exhilaration of his power surge through him, but he couldn't let himself get lost in it. There was more at stake than just a fight. Cariel and Varric charged in beside him, their weapons blazing. Jackson fought alongside them, his powers enhancing their efforts, his energy coursing through every strike, every move. It felt as though time itself had slowed down, the chaos of the battle fading into the background, as he moved with precision and purpose. But even with all the power at his disposal, Jackson knew the fight wasn't over. The enemy had only just begun. As the battle raged on, Jackson realized that this was more than just a test of strength. It was a test of his resolve, his ability to protect those he cared about. The real battle had only just begun. The sky above Siluria crackled with energy as the battle reached its peak. The ground shook underfoot as explosions echoed in the distance, sending shockwaves through the air. Jackson stood at the forefront of the chaos, his body alive with the energy he had only just begun to control. He could feel the power pulsing through him, each movement a surge of raw strength, each breath a reminder of the responsibility he had taken on. But even with all the power he had within him, the battle was far from over. The enemy forces were relentless, their numbers seeming to grow by the minute. Jackson could hear the thunderous roar of their battle machines in the distance, their dark shapes advancing like a storm. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought alongside Cariel and Varric, the sounds of their weapons ringing in his ears. Every strike, every blast of energy he unleashed felt like a lifeline. But he knew that they couldn't keep this up forever. There was something more, something he hadn't yet unlocked, that would determine the outcome of this war. Cariel's voice cut through the noise, urgent and filled with determination. Jackson, they're not just attacking us. They're after something much bigger. Jackson's eyes widened as he glanced over at her, trying to make sense of her words. What could they be after? What could be more important than defeating them? The ancient power, Cariel shouted. They're trying to destroy the source of it all. If they succeed, all hope for Siluria will be lost. We have to stop them. His heart clenched as the weight of her words settled in. He had felt the power within him, felt its pull, but he had never fully understood its true purpose. If the enemy was trying to destroy it, they weren't just fighting to conquer. They were fighting to erase everything that made Siluria unique. They had to stop them. And Jackson had to be the one to do it. Varric, who had been scanning the battlefield, turned to him. There's a facility deep in the heart of the enemy's command center. It's where the source of the power is kept. If you can get to it, you can stop them. But it won't be easy. Jackson nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. He knew what he had to do. With a single glance at Cariel, he turned and began sprinting toward the heart of the battle, the energy inside him surging with every step. His mind was focused on one goal, to reach that facility and stop the enemy from unleashing the devastation they intended. As he charged forward, the enemy soldiers began to notice him. Their weapons locked onto him, firing lasers and projectiles with precision. But Jackson didn't falter. He raised his hand, a pulse of energy shooting out from his fingertips, disintegrating the incoming fire before it could reach him. The air around him shimmered with the force of his power, and he could feel the enemy recoiling, stunned by the intensity of his assault. But the road to the facility was not going to be easy. Waves of enemy soldiers charged toward him, their movements synchronized and determined. Jackson gritted his teeth, his body moving like a blur as he dodged, attacked, and defended in rapid succession. The battle was fierce, and the enemy was relentless, but Jackson was no longer just a man. He was a force, the living embodiment of the power that Siluria depended on. Through the smoke and fire, Jackson spotted the entrance to the facility. His heart raced as he pushed forward, diving into the opening just as an explosion rocked the ground behind him. Inside, the facility was dark and cold, the hum of ancient machinery filling the silence. He could feel it, the source of the power, just beyond a set of steel doors. With a surge of energy, he blasted them open, stepping into the heart of the facility. Before him stood a massive glowing core, an ancient device that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. It was the source of Siluria's power, the key to the planet's future. But as Jackson approached, he felt a chill run down his spine. The core was surrounded by a protective shield, and at its base, the enemy commander, a tall, dark figure with cold, calculating eyes, stood waiting. "You're too late," the commander said, his voice dripping with menace. "Siluria will fall, and with it, everything you fought for." Jackson's fists clenched, his energy flaring as he stood tall, facing the enemy. "Not today," he said, his voice filled with unwavering determination. "This planet is mine to protect, and I will stop you." With a final deafening roar, Jackson unleashed everything he had, the energy within him exploding in a brilliant flash of light. The battle had come down to this moment, and Jackson was ready to give everything to save Siluria.